Cool. Well, why would he give us wrong information? We're good. $30 more seconds. Okay, we'll give it 30 more seconds. Oh, there's people coming up. Okay. No, Frank's going to OpenAI. And you have to remember the clientele. It's all the government, and Matt's about to do a thing on WXT. We're good? We're recording. Yeah, that's fine. All right. Well, everyone, let's get this going. We'll skip over the session recordings. We have push the button and push the record on the camera. We're all good. So, I'm going to have to sit down and do this, as much as this is going to pain me. Okay. So, welcome to Developing for Inclusion, Building Accessible Menus with Accessible Menu. It's a very wordy title, but I couldn't think of a better way to say it. There's a QR code that will take you to these slides if you want to follow along on your own thing. They will also be posted on Drupal Camp Auto afterwards, so we're all good. Okay, so I'm Nick. I am a front-end developer for Coldfront Labs. I've been working there for about 7 years now, and I've kind of really taken a hard spin into being one of our sticklers for accessible content on the web. I'm making sure that everything on our websites actually does meet our WCAG standards that we have to meet. And you can find me at NickDJM on basically any platform you would like. I'm on there. Or you can email me later if you want to talk about accessibility. All good. So I was going to get these slides made real quick for you guys. So I asked ChatGPT to do it for me. But unfortunately, it said, it didn't actually say this at all. It generated me a downloadable slideshow. I was very shocked. And so I had to make up this quote to keep with my joke. But it did actually make, it's terrible. I read it, it's very bad. But it did actually make a downloadable PowerPoint file for me to use. Okay. So let's talk about what makes a menu accessible. First place you should ever look. It's called the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide. If you don't know what that is, it basically is the W3C's accessibility project. And they've taken a really hard shot at making sure that any component that you might want on the web has a standard, has rules about what roles it needs, what markup it should have, and if you get into more interactive elements, like menus, it'll tell you what key bindings are expected to happen on different elements in that component. So we're going to quickly take a look. Find my mouse here. We won't go into it too deep right now. I just wanted to show you guys. It tells you like design patterns, landmarks. It goes into a deep dive on like accessible names and how you should be naming things and what components like ARIA labeled or ARIA labeled by and how those interact with various things and much more. And the particular part we're going to be looking at today is going to be the patterns library. And it tells you not only menus, but like if you wanted to make a carousel, what's the expected behavior there? Checkboxes, basic buttons, how a grid should be. What's another one that was always useful? Sliders. People like sliders, and they have two standards on it. How to make a proper accessible switch. Lots of stuff. But today, oh boy, how do we go back? Okay, I'm going to hit escape. No, that. Well, I blame Chrome, to be honest with you. But let's go back there. Yeah, anyways. When we're talking about menus, there's three main types. There are disclosure navigations, your standard kind of menu, probably the menu everyone here is like experienced. Navigation menu bars, they're more application specific kind of menus. If you think of sort of how like the start bar works on Windows at the bottom of the screen, that's a menu bar. And then there are tree views. And tree views, if you think vertical navigation and like tabbed content, books, like books on the web, would have a tree view for like chapters and stuff. And I apologize if I'm going to go through this a little fast. I have 52 slides to get through and a demo. So we're going to quickly touch on each one. So like I said, disclosure navigation is your standard navigation. It focuses on using tab to navigate through things. And it has the least amount of features of all of the menu types that you can use. Navigation menu bars, we discussed more application level menus. Instead of tabs, they focus on arrow keys to navigate through your menus, which, as a warning, can be a little confusing to people when they hit a website and they hit tab and it doesn't take them anywhere in the menu because tab functions differently. And they have character search. If you hit a key on your keyboard, it'll take you to the menu item that starts with that character. Tree views, functionality-wise, very similar to navigation menu bars, but they're vertical and hierarchical. They also use arrow keys for navigation. Tab functions differently. And they also have character search. So today we're going to be focusing on disclosure navigation because it's the one most applicable to all of you probably. And we're going to start with markup for disclosure navigation. It'll have your standard structure. So you'll have like a nav element at the root. In the nav element, you're going to have like your list, so your UL. Your list items will be the menu items. And then you will have, if it's a multi-level menu, you might have buttons that are drop-down toggles. And yes, buttons, not links. The spec actually requires your drop-down toggles to be buttons. And then A tags for links. So I whipped up a quick example of your basic structure for a disclosure navigation. So like I said, we got our nav, ULs, LIs, and As inside, and then the one drop-down I have, there's a button that's for projects. Pretty simple, pretty quick to implement. If we're talking from a Drupal perspective, this is what your Drupal menu is already going to look like. Except Drupal will have nav role equals navigation, which is a no-no actually in accessibility, because the nav inherently has the navigation role and shouldn't be adding roles when they're not needed. So, next important part, your roles and your attributes on each element. So it's pretty basic for the disclosure navigations. You'll have an ARIA controls on your button to toggle dropdowns, and it will have an ID that corresponds to the submenu that you have. You'll have your ARIA expanded on your button, and that'll be true or false depending on if your menu is open or closed. It's pretty standard. And your ARIA current on whatever A tag happens to be the current page you're on. Some people who are familiar with making menus might notice there is no ARIA has pop-up for your drop-down button. You don't need it anymore. It's been removed from the spec for disclosure navigations. My guess would be because a pop-up inherently is like a visual thing, and you're already explaining to someone that a button controls a navigation with ARIA controls. You don't need to say it twice, basically. It's like, I control this menu, and it's a pop-up. It's like, well, yes, obviously. So we have our standard markup, and we will add our ARIA roles and attributes that are needed. We have our ARIA current page on the home page, because we'll just pretend we're on the home page. We have our ARIA controls for the project submenu, and we've given our UL and ID of project submenu. And we're going to start with our menu collapse, so ARIA expanded would be false. As far as accessible markup goes, you are now done. Your menu is now accessible from a markup standpoint. Next thing you have to consider, going to be key bindings. One of them is given to you for free by the browser, because Tab and Shift Tab should move focus among top level buttons and into or out of drop downs if they're open. Your browser does that for you. It tabs to different links. As long as you don't have like something hiding it from the tab index, you're fine there. You don't have to worry about that one. Space or enter needs to activate links or buttons. That is not given to you for free from browsers. Space on buttons, I do not believe activates buttons by default. So you'll have to add your own trigger for that. Everything else, I believe, works as expected. Escape, if you're inside a dropdown, escape will close it and focus the button that controls the menu. And then you have 3 other requirements, which you can see, optional. They're in the spec. They are flagged as optional. Your menu doesn't need them, but it's always a nice to have. So your down and right arrows should move focus forward through the menu and submenus. So if you just hit the right arrow when you're tabbed into your menu, it'll just keep going through all your menu items. And up and left, the reverse. You just go backwards. And then home and end should focus the first and last item in a menu or submenu, respectively. So those 3 you will absolutely have to write yourself. They are not supported by browsers by default. But to be fair, they're optional. You technically don't need them. But I like to have them. They're nice to use. So, I mentioned that the disclosure menu was the least amount of features of a menu. So I'm going to take us through just a very brief look at what the other ones will look like in the spec. And so there's your disclosure menu. It's hidden under just disclosure. There's a sublink that's for navigation. Let's take a look at menu bars. So here you'll see it defines a lot of stuff that menu bars should do. And it's very wordy and hard to follow. But if you go to an example, it's a lot easier to read. So you'll get how it should function live. So you will see all the different factors of a menu you'll have. It'll tell you your accessibility features that are required, and then it goes into keyboard support. So a menu bar, space and enter need to activate items. Right arrow needs to move focus to the next item in the menu bar, and if the focus is on the last item, it moves focus to the first item in the menu bar. Left arrow, the reverse. So if it is focused on the first, it needs to go to the last and traverse through there. Down arrow, if you're on a submenu, needs to focus the submenu's last child, first child. Up arrow, last child. Home and end would function the same as your disclosure menu. And there's a character search. If you hit like the A key, it should take you to the next element in the menu that starts with A. Then there's a whole separate list of key bindings for what should happen when you're in a submenu. Most of it is the same. We add escape. So if you're in a submenu, hit escape. It needs to close the submenu. The right arrow will do something completely different. It will move focus to the parent menu's next item. And if that item is also a submenu, it needs to open that submenu. And so you can see, you start getting into a lot more complexity when you're dealing with something other than just a disclosure navigation. And so you get into roles of how everything needs to function. And where is it here? Here's what I wanted to mention. So I mentioned tab doesn't work the same way in a menu bar or a tree view. Only one element at a time in that menu bar can be focusable by tab. So your current menu item that you end up on will have tab index of 0. Every other menu item is going to be removed from the tab index. So you hit tab, you enter back to where you were in the menu. You hit tab again, you exit the menu. And so it gets really complicated, really fast when you're talking about something other than disclosure menus. And I guess I can show you guys the difference when we look at just disclosure navigation, which is our standard, what we expect navigation to look like. That's the end of our keyboard support. There's not multiple pages of keyboard support. It's just one. Pretty straightforward. And so, I mean, I could show you tree views, but the list just goes on like menu bars. They're very long. It exited me right out of presenter view. Okay. So, other considerations you want to take when you're making a menu with folks being accessible. Color contrast should be at least 4.5. Don't have like this nice faded text for your menu items. No one's going to be able to read that. Visible, hover, active, and focus states. Technically, in the WCAG guidelines, you need to have 2 differentiating factors when you're focusing or hovering on something, and one is allowed to be a color change. The other needs to be something else. That does include your mouse changing. So like hover, if the mouse changes to a little hover guy, it counts technically. You also need to take into consideration, how does your menu work on a touch screen? Do you have hover effects? Because they won't work on a touch screen. And another thing to keep in mind will be when you're writing your own event listeners, most people will do key down. So when you push the left arrow, key down the left arrow, you move somewhere. But if someone doesn't release that key right away, it'll keep triggering. So they could fly through a menu in seconds. So it's technically better to keep your actual events that trigger functionality to key up, because you only release the key once. Okay. Why is this all important? So on the w3.org, I found a really nice quote I liked. Navigation menus reflect the underlying structure of websites. Thus, menus are critical parts of web pages and applications and require particular attention during design and development. I really like this quote, mostly because just time and time again, whenever we sit down and we're actually building a client, a new site, or redesigning their site, there is a substantial amount of time that goes into just the header. Like, what does their navigation look like? What's in their navigation? How does it function? How do they want to implement a mobile shelf opening up? Because everyone wants mobile shelves. They don't want drop-down menus anymore. All of this there's so much that goes into making the main navigation of a site. And accessibility shouldn't actually be like a side note. So people who use screen readers will hear your website. They won't see your website, not necessarily. Some might. They have a different set of key bindings that are provided by the screen reader. And the roles and like your markup of your menu will actually help screen readers figure out those key bindings that they need to add for people who use screen readers. So who benefits from screen readers? People who are visually impaired, people who may have dyslexia and can't read properly, people who have just literacy difficulties. Maybe they're learning a language and they can understand it spoken to them better than they can read it right now. So they might be using a screen reader to figure out your site. And people who don't really feel like reading today might use a screen reader. Really all this is to say, you don't actually have to have any sort of disability to use a screen reader. You could utilize it in day-to-day life. You don't know who's going to be looking at your site. There are also keyboard users, people who don't or cannot use a mouse. So tabbing and like other key bindings with arrows and keyboard searches become super important for them. And this is where I talk about like key up events are more controllable because you only release your key once. Someone who might have a cognitive disability who can't really move maybe as fast as you could hold down the key for longer than you're expecting. And browsers fire key down events like once a millisecond. So they're going to fly through your menu. So who benefits from keyboards? People with motor impairments. People who use screen readers will use a keyboard generally. People who like to just tab through websites will use a keyboard. And people whose wireless mouse has run out of batteries will use a keyboard. There's also touch device users. You have to consider hover isn't a thing. I've put an asterisk here because some devices will have your stylus pen, and stylus pens are starting to have hover. It's not really the same kind of hover you're expecting. Tabbing really isn't a thing on a touch device unless you then have a keyboard, and then you fall into keyboard users. And touch events are similar to click events, but they do have very important differences. You can cancel a touch event. You can't cancel a click. So who benefits from touch devices? People who have motor or cognitive disabilities, people with tablets, people with phones. For maybe a joke for one person in the room. You guys all have phones, right? So why is all this important? It's because it helps people. It doesn't matter if they have a disability or not. If you make your menu more usable, it's going to help everyone use your site. And I found that, and it made me laugh, and I had to add it to myself. So, why is making accessible menus so hard? Clients really like having their unique sites, and they generally want unique and don't really care about accessible. It's not that they don't care about accessible. They know they need to be accessible. They don't really know what that means half the time, and it's kind of an afterthought for them. So they might have custom styles, animations, menu items might be strange. You don't know, so it becomes a real problem to keep things consistent. There are different frameworks. There's Bootstrap, WXT, aka Bootstrap, Tailwind CSS. There's some, like Tailwind CSS doesn't even have any JavaScript to it when you're in the compiled version. It's just CSS. You're going to have to find another solution for your own functionality. And markup can be weird. You might have divs wrapped around strange items. Links and buttons might be generated. Your menu is all links. You have to consider, well, then drop-down menus need to have that link needs to have the role, a button, to tell the screen readers that it's actually a button, not a link. And Drupal does not help with markup being weird. Drupal adds so many divs around everything, it's ridiculous. So what are our solutions? There's a project called Accessible Mega Menu. It is jQuery based. Lots of people know jQuery. It's still around, I know. And clients love mega menus. Oh my goodness, does everyone want a menu that just opens up the entire screen and shows you everything on their site? Cons to this, it's jQuery, and we're not in the year 2010 anymore. We can give up jQuery. It's okay, everyone. And accessible mega menu may have once been accessible. It no longer follows the APG. Bootstrap. It's nice and responsive. It's easy to use. There's tons of support. It's great to use. And if you're using V5, it's not jQuery. Unfortunately, it is relatively heavy for a library. You've got to load a lot to get Bootstrap working. If you're using V3 or V4, which is WXT, it's still very heavily seated in jQuery. And it does not follow the APG. And out of the box, Bootstrap is not accessible. The colors are not guaranteed to be accessible. They say it on their website. So what about Vue.js, React, or Angular? Tons of options. More than I could even find and go through for this presentation. Super popular frameworks. They're not jQuery. But it does require a framework to use if you want to install this just for your menu. And a lot of options do not follow the APG. There are some that do. Like I found a couple that make very good efforts to do it. But again, you still have to load a whole framework to get your menu working. So what about custom implementation? The pros, it will be very popular and easy to use. It's going to, OSS maintainers treated very well historically. No one complains about open source maintainers. It's not going to be jQuery, it follows the APG, and there are no cons. Nothing could go wrong. Can't think of it. So, enter accessible menu. So we made this project, and our goals were to make a library that makes making accessible navigation simple. Accessibility needs to be the priority, not the afterthought. There's no CSS involved. We will add classes for opening and closing, and properties will change, but nothing else. We didn't want to get into styles. We want it to be platform agnostic. We don't want any dependencies. We want to make it as small as possible. And we need to support all browsers, Chrome, Firefox, Safari. And this project was made in 2019. So we had to support Internet Explorer still. So I'm going to go show you guys a demo. Later on, if you want to see the demo, that is where it is. It's public. You can see my site that I'm using for it. And again, these slides will be provided on Drupal Camp's website, so you can get this link afterwards as well. So let's take a look. I'll show you guys what we did. So I'm going to assume everyone knows how to do some basic theming in Drupal. We have defined a library that includes our accessible menu script, and that's it. We've made a JavaScript file that will load that and use it, and then we've globally required it on our theme. So, just do that. So our file will take an accessible menu. We'll use Drupal and once to get the elements we need. And we'll have a behavior just so it loads. We'll load our main navigation using once. And then this is the entirety of what you need to get accessible menu working. That 3-line snippet there. You make a new menu, you initialize the class, and you pass it a menu element you're expecting to be the menu. And hit tab, so we can tab through. We can, oh, did my internet cut out again? Yes, 1 second. The pains of demos. Cool. I'm going to hit Tab. I can hit Shift Tab, and if I hit Enter on my menu, it opens up and it closes. And if we want to go explore the markup, let's make that a little bigger for people. We can see mostly our drop downs, because that's where our biggest changes happen. We have our drop down. It has an ARIA expanded false, has an ARIA controls of this UL that has an ID. And when we click it, ARIA expanded true, ARIA expanded false. Done. Nothing else needed. If we wanted to get more fancy, we can later once I go through the slides, but that's really all it takes. It's this, you literally just have a new class, you pass it the DOM element, and it adds all of the key bindings. If something's missing an ID, it will generate one for you, which is what you're seeing here. You'll notice the ID is menu, menu types, and then a random string. So it's trying to generate an ID that will be unique, and it will be able to use for all of the various ARIA properties that need them. Yeah, and that's basically the entirety of how to use accessible menu. We'll get into more, don't worry. So, how did we get to this magic spot of it just works? Started in 2019. We focused on Bootstrap 3 WXT. And there was only menu bar support. In 2020, we removed out-of-the-box Bootstrap because we ended up having some clients who did not have Bootstrap but wanted an accessible menu, so then we had to expand. So out-of-the-box Bootstrap support was removed, and we added the disclosure menu support. Then in 2021, in version 3, we really made the project extendable because we made a class called base menu that everything bases itself off of. So if you needed to make your own custom implementation of a menu, you extend that for all your base functionality, and then just add on to it, just like how the Drupal community is used to with plugins and stuff. We added the tree view support. We added a fully automated documentation site, uses JSDoc. So we had code comments, and they were compiled all into one website that gave you API docs. And we added automated tests. And this year, we released V4. We added a thing called a top link disclosure menu, which is where your top level of menu has a link and a button beside each other that make up the drop-down menu. So you can click the link and go to a page, and then the button controls opening and closing the menu. And then we did a lot of behind-the-scenes improvements, which I can get into if we have time, but they're going into a lot of swapping on the back end. And then we did a documentation overhaul. We decided that automated documentation wasn't cutting it, so we made some manual documentation that was better. And a lot of automated tests were overhauled. And so it's been a long road. It's been 5 years. And last year on JS Deliver, we got over 7 million individual browser hits, which was pretty cool. I've never had a project go over 20,000. So this was well, I made the emoji. It really exploded my mind to see how many pages loaded accessible menu last year. So where are we going in the future? We're going to make some documentation improvements. There's some pages that do need some work that could be clarified. We have some new features coming for tree views because they changed the spec on something, and now I have to go add some stuff. And we're looking into adding a couple new menu types that will be fun. And more. And we're getting a lot of issues opened on GitHub that are more like, hey, I'm trying to use this in this situation and it doesn't work. How do I do it? which is kind of nice to see because it means more people are actually starting to use it and getting really into it and finding all the bugs that I don't find. So we're going to go back to the demo site because this is Drupal camp. And adding a third-party library to a Drupal site is nice and all. But wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to do any of that? Just got rid of all the custom implementation entirely. So when we go back to this site, no more custom stuff. These don't work anymore. We've removed all the implementation. Wouldn't it be nice? Just on the back end, go to your main navigation, and you just turn on, I want a disclosure menu. And want to know what? Let's add the optional key support and hover. And we hit save. And then when we go here, now hover works. When we tab, I'm going to use arrow keys and not tab, and it works. Enter key works, more arrow keys, and the escape key. It'd be super great if this was a Drupal module that you could just install and use. So we're working on the accessible menu Drupal module to hopefully make it super easy. You just install it, you select the menu type you want, move on with your day. No custom code required. So we're always looking for contributors. If you go to accessible-menu.dev, that's the documentation site. We'll also link you to GitHub if you want to just look at it, or if you find a bug, or you want to make something new and cool, or if you want to improve the documentation. Feel free, look at it, open an issue. That'd be great. Any questions? Yes. Yes, so that wouldn't be covered by accessible menu. Drupal adds the skip to content button in most of its templates, so that's kind of outside of the scope of what accessible menu does. Yes?
So would like the accessible menu module override like whatever default menu is in like your Drupal?
So this is where it gets tricky. So there's some links in the back of this I've provided for people. Because we run into this problem with Bootstrap 5. Because Bootstrap 5 started adding key bindings to menus. And so you run into, well, if I hit the arrow key, both accessible menu and Bootstrap are moving the arrow. And so it moves 2 items instead of 1, and that's really frustrating. Obviously, it's going to be a case-by-case basis. But in like an example of Bootstrap, where our Bootstrap 5 variant actually loads the Bootstrap like JavaScript, finds the menu that it's trying to control, and deletes it. Because we're trying to make it seamless, right? Like we don't want to also have like, oh, you're using Bootstrap and you want to use accessible menu. Well, first you got to make sure that your menu's not loaded into Bootstrap, and then you can use our. It's just like, no, load it. We'll take care of removing the other key bindings for you. Now, there's probably some themes in Drupal that also add those key bindings. That would have to be a specific scenario where, like, oh, you would have to make a variant for that theme that would look at what's happening and making sure it doesn't add the key bindings. Let's go back to there. Any other questions?
It also creates the ARIA roles automatically.
Yes. So you technically just need to give it markup. Like the markup needs to be proper by default. And it will add all the roles, all the IDs, everything for you. It will find everything. And like in the case of a disclosure menu, if your drop-downs are links and not buttons, it will see that and add role button onto your disclosure toggles. And what I can do is I'll show you guys the difference between disclosure menu and top link disclosure menu, because they are different. I'm going to have to save, and then I have to edit one thing. So you'll notice that for my demo here, I have the menu items buttons. If anyone didn't know, you can pass open tag, button, close tag into Drupal, and your menu item will render as a button. It won't render as a link. But in the case of a top link disclosure menu, you probably want those to be a link because they need to go somewhere. We'll pretend to go somewhere. Save menu. We'll go here, and we'll see my live demo not work because that's how it. Oh, awesome. So now we have menu types, which have changed to a link, is now a link. And then there's a secondary button beside it that controls the drop-down. And we have hover on. When you hover over, it will still open the menu because that's how hover is expected. When you're hovering over the menu item, you expect the drop-down to open. So you can hover over either of these, and your drop-down menu will open. And I didn't go into it at all because I didn't think we were going to have time, but we have a little bit of time. So you can actually, because I mentioned you have to have the right markup by default. You can get really creative with your markup, and as long as you tell accessible menu you're doing that, it will make your menu work and be accessible. And we kind of do that with the Bootstrap variants. So there are a lot of options you can pass to. Well, this is beginner, and we're about to go into source code. Okay. You can pass a lot of options to this menu when it's being created, because everything is based on selectors, just like your regular old CSS query string selectors. So you can tell it my menu item might not be an LI, it might be something else. You should still make it a list item. You should not use an LI, but if for some reason you couldn't have that option, you actually just have to pass it a query selector, and it'll figure it out. So like drop-downs, they don't need to be buttons or links. You can use a class. So you could have a button that's a drop-down and a link that's a drop-down. They function the same way once the accessible menu ran over it. Yeah, there's a lot of options we can get into, and I'm more than happy to talk about this for hours, but it's probably a bit too much of a scope for today. Any other questions? Otherwise, I will release you all into the world. Gotta hit the buttons.